Hey guys, so we are going to do our notes today about written language like this. So I have passed out to you the Cornell Notes form for the origin of language, and you guys are going to fill them out as we go. So our first little square that you see on here talks about Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia is a civilization about 3,000 years ago. And we've already watched the short little crash course video about what Mesopotamia is, and now we're going to go a little more in depth into the language aspect of it. Um, so we had cave drawings that told stories before, but they discovered these tablets in where ancient Mesopotamia is, and I'm sorry, that was a big yawn. These were meant to say something. Okay, and the first thing that they used was pictograms. So a pictogram is like a little picture that's meant to represent your words or ideas. And these pictograms were mainly used for agriculture and business. So if you look at this tablet here and you see the shapes, you can tell that they're farming related and they're implement related. So you have like the pitchfork, and you have the wheat, and you have the corn stalk. And so those pictograms were meant to, maybe this is like an old-timey, like an ancient receipt, like I gave you this much corn and you owe me this much wheat. I don't know. But they were meant to represent something. So the pictograms are pictures used to represent words. So after the pictograms, we slowly see them become more symbolic than pictographic. So you see here they have dots with the pictures representing something. Maybe that represented an amount, maybe that represented something else completely. But you see them, the pictographs are starting to change. And you can understand why they would do this, because everybody's going to draw a pictograph a little bit differently. So they're starting to unify what their shapes are supposed to be. And that is when they're going to stop, and they're going to go into a wedge-shaped symbol. And let me just get this off of here. This wedge-shaped symbol is called cuneiform. That's this word right here, C-U-N-E-I-F-O-R-M, cuneiform. Cuneiform is what we consider to be the first real written language, because these symbols, these wedge-shaped symbols, they represented either words or sounds. And when you put them together, they made sentences, and they even made the first, what we would consider to be the first real work of literature written out, which is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh was a hugely long poem that was written out in cuneiform on tablets, and it was discovered. So you could see how they could be deciphered into words. Sorry guys, I'm yawning again. Oh my goodness. So we've talked about how language and words are just sounds that we've decided mean something. Well, letters are just shapes we decide mean something. And we've just all agreed as a society on a whole that those shapes represent something specific. And we can decipher them. Reading is just deciphering what those shapes together mean. And so with cuneiform, you see that. These shapes represent something. And just because I can't read it, and you can't read it, doesn't mean they aren't valid. They don't really represent something. So I'm going to show you this, this chart. So this chart is, sorry guys, I needed to clean that up a little bit. So this chart are things that we think were symbolized with cuneiform and how they've progressed over time. So if you look at this, this is definitely a sun, right? So this outline character was definitely shaped out to be a sun. And then they started adding little wedge shapes to it, so it started to look even more like a sun, and that was about 2500 BCE. Then the Assyrians, which were a group of people that lived in Mesopotamia, they changed it even more until we got over here to the late Babylonians in 500 BCE that changed it definitely into shape. So you can hardly see that those two things would have been the same thing, but they do mean the same thing. And so then you have God in heaven, and you see the same similar transition. Mountain, I think, is really interesting because you can tell why the pictograph for mountain was that. I'm not sure when the wedges got turned around, but then they became a more interesting shape. Sorry. Man, this would have been a man like laying down. This would have been the figure of a man. And he got a little more definition. And then we ended up with these shapes. Ox, I think, is interesting because the end shape of an ox is very similar to the beginning shape of it. And then you have fish. So those are just examples of how they progressed through time. Okay, so they progressed from one shape in the pictograph over to fully into cuneiform without any kind of pictograph there. If you were just looking at this, you wouldn't be able to say, oh, hey, that means, that's a shape that looks like a mountain. Okay, so it's completely different. So now we want to talk about the scribes. So who was able to use this language? It is very common now for everyone you know to be able to read or write, but that's not how it used to be in ancient Mesopotamian times. Only the most wealthy and educated people were allowed to become scribes. And to be more precise, they were the only ones who were allowed to let their sons go be scribes, because what happened was generally a young boy about 7 or 8 would be chosen by the current scribes, and they would go and live in the temples, in the holy ziggurats, and they would learn the language, and they would learn the symbols, and they would learn how to create the tablets. And so when I say they lived a monastic life, they weren't allowed to get married. They weren't allowed to travel or do anything. They were considered in high regard. They were very high up on the social ladder, but they weren't allowed to live a normal life, because if they got married and went off and started their own family, then they would lose their scribe. And if you only have a couple of scribes who can read or write, then you don't want to sacrifice them for any reason. So it was only a few people who were able to read and who were able to write. And so anytime you wanted something read or written, you had to go to the scribes. Then, so what did they use? They used clay. They wrote on clay tablets, and they used the stylus. So they craft the stylus here out of wood, and they would use it in the wet clay to carve in the shapes and the wedges. And as they got farther and farther along in history, they became more pointed and became more pencil-like, which allowed them to make more precise shapes. So that is how we are able to know a lot about what happened in Mesopotamia, because these scribes, yes, they used it for business, but a lot of it was recording what was going on at the time. And so we are able to decipher these because we found a stone called the Rosetta Stone, which is a translation stone that they found. It's actually a tablet, a stone tablet with different alphabets on it, which allow for the translation of the Mesopotamian scrolls, or not scrolls, tablets, the Mesopotamian tablets. So they use the writing for business, but they also use the writing for history. And why? Why did they use the clay and the stylus? Well, that's because that's what they had. There was not an invention of paper until the Egyptian civilization. So they had to use what they had around them, and they had clay. They could make clay, and they knew that if they carved in the clay, it would stay in a certain way. Paint would fade over time, wouldn't be as trustworthy, but clay would stay. And some of the tablets were painted on for sure, but the writing was done with the stylus in the clay. So we know that this is where the creation of language began, and a lot are not language itself, but written language. And the reason we know about these civilizations is because they wrote it down. And it's more trustworthy to write something down than it is to rely on oral histories. Everything that came before this was what's called an oral history. They just told stories from one generation to the next. And you've all played gossip or telephone, whatever you call it, and you know that when you tell a person one story, they're going to tell it a little differently. So the history that is an oral history that wasn't written down is not as trustworthy as the one that was written down by people who were there when it was happening. Okay, we're going to move on to our next little activity. So when you're finished with your notes, turn them into the proper slot on the cabinet. All right, guys, thanks.